Right, God's Omniscience and Man's Free Will by William Lane Craig. This is William Lane Craig answering a question that was asked of him. And I want to play a couple clips here and see if we can't ascertain some of the truth of this issue. The issue is concerning God's omniscience, rather his omni-Prescience. That's the term I use, omni-Prescience, meaning God's all beforehand knowledge, his exhaustive foreknowledge, his infallible exhaustive foreknowledge. And he's going to give a syllogism that I want to look at, and then he's going to give an analogy, a crude human analogy that I also want to look at and ask some questions about. So let's listen to Dr. William Lane Craig answer this question concerning God's omniscience and man's free will.
Now, the fatalist says that if God foreknows what you're going to do, then when the time arrives for you to do it, you're not free to do anything else because God cannot be mistaken. And since he has believed from eternity that you're going to do it, that means you're fated to do it. It seems to me, however, that the argument for logical or theological fatalism commits a fallacy in modal logic. This is the logic of necessity and possibility. The fatalist reasons like this: necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. 2, God foreknows X. 3, therefore, necessarily X will happen. So, premise 1, necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. 2, God foreknows X. 3, therefore, necessarily X will happen. And if X happens necessarily, it means it's not free. That commits a logical fallacy. From the 2 premises, you cannot deduce that necessarily X will happen. All that follows is simply X will happen, but not necessarily. It could fail to happen. But if it were to fail to happen, then God would have foreknown something different. So by your actions, you have the ability, by what you do, in a sense, to determine what God will have believed in the past.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there, and let's take a look at this syllogism that he just gave. And this is his syllogism as he sees it regarding Reformed theology or Calvinistic theology. Okay, necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. God foreknows X, therefore necessarily X will happen. And he wants to say, no, not necessarily. And then essentially he's going to say God's knowledge, his omni-Prescience, is dependent upon man. It is dependent upon the events that would occur in creation. That's how God knows all things, is because it's the creation and creatures and the choices they make in time sort of feeding back to God his omni-Prescience of the things that will occur in time in his creation. That's what I'm totally going to refute, rebuke, as this is utter falsehood. God's omni-Prescience is not dependent upon the creation. It is dependent upon himself alone, and specifically his divine decisional decree. Okay, I am a divine decisional decretal determinist, no question about that. Dr. Craig likes to use the term theistic fatalist. I don't use the term fatalist of myself just because of the sort of negative pagan connotations that goes along with it. But divine determinist, most certainly I am. But we're going to see in this syllogism that he gives, this is actually a straw man of my position, for example, as a Calvinist, because he omits a key relevant issue that would have to be a part of the syllogism to be accurate. Okay? And therefore he is committing the logical fallacy of omission. So think about it in a court of law, where if you get on the witness stand and they ask, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Well, the whole truth means don't commit fallacies of omission. Don't omit key relevant information that will be relevant in your testimony. Okay? Don't commit the fallacy of omission, and that's what Dr. Craig has done here. The proper syllogism would be put like this: if God infallibly foreknows, and you heard Dr. Craig use the term God can't be mistaken. That's what infallibility means. It means without mistake, without error. Okay? He can't be proved wrong. So that's why this is a better syllogism to give. If God infallibly foreknows X, then X will of necessity happen, or certainly happen. God does infallibly foreknow X, Therefore, X will of necessity happen. Okay? This is the proper syllogism. So he omitted the word infallibility or infallibly from his syllogism, but it needs to be there. God's omni-Prescience is infallible. He can't be proved wrong. It is not mistaken. So the question is of the infallibility of God's omni-Prescience. Dr. Craig, okay, the infallible barometer analogy, we're going to go on. So the syllogism is bad, and now I want to go on to the example of the crude human analogy of the barometer that he's going to give here.
His knowledge is sort of like an infallible barometer of the weather. The barometer never fails. It's always right. But clearly, the barometer doesn't determine the weather. If the weather were different, the barometer would have been different. So the foreknowledge of God is like an infallible barometer, and you're free to do whatever you want, but you're just not free to fool the barometer. God knows whatever it is you do. So,
okay. So let's see, an infallible. Now he uses the word infallible when he gets to his crude human, his really bad analogy of God's knowledge, his omni-Prescience being like a barometer. He says it's like an infallible barometer, but he omitted the word infallible from the syllogism that he gave. So again, some misrepresentation. And then, of course, his infallible barometer analogy is really an argumentum ad absurdum, or a reductio ad absurdum. It's an argument from absurdity. And we're going to find out why. But why does Dr. Craig now insert the word infallible into his crude analogy? He didn't include it in his syllogism, so why add it here? One has to wonder. Again, some inconsistency in the man's thinking. That's what it is. But Craig goes on to state that clearly the barometer doesn't determine the weather. Now we have to just pause for a moment and ask, well, the barometer doesn't determine the weather, therefore the weather determines what the barometer knows or what the barometer communicates. See, that's what Dr. Craig wants to say, is that we determine what God foreknows. And we're going to see a couple clips of that in a moment. But does Dr. Craig honestly wish to make a comparison between a barometer and the almighty triune God? Because that's what he's doing. He's comparing God's knowledge to a barometer. Question, is a barometer omnipotent? Answer, no. Question, can a barometer tell us of the past and why it happened? Answer, no, not unless it's some digital barometer and it keeps recordings of all the recordings it has made. Question, can a barometer tell us what shall happen in the future? That's important. And the answer, of course, is no. Most importantly, is a barometer dependent on something external to itself, i.e. the weather, to give it information? Okay? Now let's answer a few of these questions here from Isaiah chapter 41, verses 21 through 23. God speaking of the futility of idols. He says, set forth your case, you idols, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. So future stuff. Tell us the former things, past stuff, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcomes. Again, future stuff. Or declare to us the things to come. Future stuff. Tell us what is to come hereafter, future stuff, that we may know that you are gods. Again, those rhetorical questions, obviously, not something a barometer can do either. Okay. Let's move on. This is the important thing here, is that in the Reformed view, in the Calvinistic view, we hold that God's exhaustive foreknowledge of all events of his creation, including the decisions of creatures, does not depend on creatures or the creation itself sort of feeding back to God his knowledge of us. Rather, his omni-Prescience depends on himself alone, namely his decisional decree, or his decretive will. This view protects what we call the aseity of God, that is, what God is in and of himself. Aseity comes from the Latin ase, meaning of self. Okay, God possesses exhaustive omni-Prescience, all beforehand knowledge, and that knowledge comes from himself alone, namely his decree. Dr. Craig is denying that God's exhaustive foreknowledge comes from himself alone. Rather, Craig asserts that God's omni-Prescience is dependent upon man and his actions and choices in time and the events that occur in time. We're going to see a couple clips of that in a second. It is of utmost importance to understand that for Dr. Craig and other Molinists like him, God's knowledge is dependent upon the creation, rather than creatures being dependent upon God for all their knowledge. Indeed, we should wholeheartedly agree with Francis Turretin against the false teaching of middle knowledge when he wrote, "This middle knowledge, this idea of middle knowledge that William Lane Craig holds to, takes away the dominion of God over free acts, because according to it, the acts of the will are supposed to be antecedent or logically prior to the decree, and therefore have their futurition not from God, but from itself. Indeed, God would seem rather to depend upon the creature, while he, God, could decree or dispose nothing unless a determination of the human will were posited, which God would see in such a connection of things." That's from Turretin's Institutes of Eclectic Theology, Volume 1, page 215, the George Musgrave Geiger translation. Dr. Craig thinks that God's omni-Prescience is ultimately determined by the creature and the events that occur in time, rather than arising from himself and his decree alone. He does this, again, to protect his fallacious definition of human libertarian free will, which we've gotten into before in other videos. Thus, Craig's false man-made philosophies seek to destroy an element of the aseity of God, his omni-Prescience, arising from himself alone via his decisional decree. The Reformed view is that God is omniprescient because his knowledge arises from himself alone. His omniprescience arises from his decisional decree alone. No creature can grant to God knowledge of any kind concerning his creation. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Romans 11:34, and see also Isaiah 40, verse 13, and Job 36, verses 22 and 23. Dr. Craig's view is that all God's knowledge ultimately comes from his creation, that all creation and creatures within it are God's counselor, giving him knowledge. Okay, this is again this is a rhetorical question here. Who has been God's counselor? Answer: no one. No one. But Dr. Craig's view in middle knowledge, the Molinism that he holds to, says that we are all God's counselor. Okay? Again, this borders on blasphemy. This is why Reformed scholars like Francis Turretin refuted such nonsense. Turretin called out the Jesuit invention of middle knowledge for the fraud that it was and is. He wrote, quote, "The idea of middle knowledge was devised by the Jesuits, Pedro de Fonseca, Leonardo Lessius, and Louis de Molina, and the design of the Jesuits was to defend the semi-Pelagian heresy of foreseen faith and good works in election, and to support the figment of free will in order the more easily to free themselves from the arguments of the Dominicans who rejected such foresight." And I would say also probably most likely the Jansenists as well. These are two different Roman Catholic sects. So you have the Jesuits, Roman Catholic sect, and the Dominicans and the Jansenists. And so the Jesuits and the Dominicans and the Jansenists were all kind of fighting amongst each other about these issues. And notice what Turretin goes on to say. The Pope, in the meantime, to whose tribunal the whole matter was frequently referred for his infallible judgment, speaking sarcastically there a little bit, in an affair of so great moment, slept and did not dare to determine anything. This invention of middle knowledge was afterwards adopted by the Socinians and Remonstrants, that is, the Arminians, who courageously defend it so as to preserve human free will in the citadel. Again, I hope this helps in understanding why Calvin has pushed so hard against the teachings of William Lane Craig and others and the Jesuit scholars he has chosen to follow in his fallacious arguments for middle knowledge in God. Because Dr. William Lane Craig makes God's foreknowledge, his exhaustive, infallible foreknowledge, dependent upon man, upon the creature and the creation and the events that occur in time in his creation. Let's look at another clip from Dr. William Lane Craig. I've played this clip before, but let's just make sure we understand that he is explicitly making the statement that God's knowledge is dependent upon man.
We've been talking about divine omniscience, God's being all-knowing. And in the last class, we raised a problem that is occasioned by God's knowledge of the future. If God foreknows everything that happens, including our choices, then are we really free to do otherwise than as God foreknows we shall do? In other words, does God's foreknowledge imply a kind of theological fatalism about the future, that everything that happens happens necessarily? And I argue that that conclusion does not follow, so long as we keep clear the distinction between the chronological priority of God's knowledge to the event foreknown, but the logical or explanatory priority of the event foreknown to God's knowledge. God's knowledge does not determine the event. If we use the language of determine, we would say that the event determines what God foreknows. So when
The event determines what God foreknows. And of course, I'm in agreement to say that his foreknowledge does not determine whatsoever comes to pass. That comes from his decree, and his knowledge comes from his decree. So his knowledge doesn't determine whatsoever comes to pass. It's his decree that determines whatsoever comes to pass. And his decree is what gives rise to his omni-Prescience. That's why we say all knowledge comes from God and himself alone. All knowledge that God possesses comes from himself alone. Okay? He is not dependent upon the creation or any creatures or any events that occur in time for his knowledge of them. Okay? Dr. Craig wants to say the exact opposite. Nope. God is complete. His foreknowledge, his omni-Prescience is completely dependent upon the actions that occur in time, the events that occur in time, and the choices that his creatures would make in time. This is utterly false. That would make God dependent upon his creation and the creatures for his knowledge. Okay? So that is an attack on an area of what we call theology proper, the study of the attributes of God, one of those attributes of God being omni-Prescience. This is an attack on the omni-Prescience of God, attempting to take God down from off of his throne and placing man or the creation upon it, since God is dependent upon creatures and the creation. Okay, let's take a look at this is Pastor Mike Winger, and we could go to people like Dr. Braxton Hunter as well, but this is Pastor Mike, and he follows the sort of Molinistic view of William Lane Craig, and he's going to explain the same. He's going to say the same thing. God's knowledge is dependent on the choices that I make
before I do it. But what he's knowing is not, that's chronologically prior, but it's not logically before the thing I do. He knows it because I'm going to do it. So could I have free will? Here's how it would work. Let's say I get home and instead of editing and getting this video online, I decide, I don't feel like it, I'm tired.
So he knows it before I'm going to do it.
I was at camp all week with teenagers, and I just want to sleep. I'm just going to go home and watch The Flash with Allison and then go to sleep. So let's suppose that that's our decision, and we do that instead. Now, God will know that instead of the other thing. So if I choose to not edit, the Lord knew I would choose not to edit. And he knew it before I chose it, but he knew it because I chose it. Does that help at all?
Okay. No, it didn't. And my camera seized up on me over here. So I'm going to leave it at that. You can see that he thinks this is a tenable argument, that God's knowledge is dependent upon the choices that I make for his knowledge of it. That's the only way he has knowledge, is because we sort of feed back to God knowledge, and that's how we know stuff. I say absolutely not workable, not acceptable in any Christian circle at all. So I hope this is helpful. Post your questions, comments down below. Let me know what you think about all that. Talk to you soon. Soli Deo Gloria.